Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized from her office.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our panelists for being here today. I want to start by taking a look at this from the perspective of local governments, as several of you have done. You know, I used to be the chief of staff for the mayor of Minneapolis, and I know firsthand the challenges that that cities have trying to balance their budgets.
You need those notes.
Start from the perspective of where we are with the Inflation Reduction Act. This bill is going to go a long way towards, one, cleaning up our electric power grid, two, helping us to make everything that we do as energy efficient as possible, and third, electrifying as much as we can. All of that, as Senator Warren just said, is going to result in significant emissions reductions. It is going to result in significant job growth, and it's going to improve the health of Americans everywhere, especially in communities that have been most impacted by fossil fuel pollution, poor communities and communities of color. But if you think about what this means in terms of local governments that are trying to run cities in the midst of the incredible expense of climate, of the climate crisis, that's what I sort of want to dive into a little bit. So, Mr. Florida, we know that local communities are already taking action around climate. There was you talked about what that looks like in Ohio, and I know that in Minnesota, many of our communities are doing the same thing. There was just a great story in the New York Times about Morris, Minnesota, and what that community is doing to address the climate crisis. But so could you talk to us a little bit about how these things that we're accomplishing in the Inflation Reduction Act, cleaning up the grid, improving energy efficiency, and helping people to electrify home appliances and other things like that. Could you talk to us a little bit transportation? Could you talk to us a little bit about how that's going to help local governments as they're trying to figure out how to balance their budgets every year?
Thank you for the question. When we did this report to assess the costs of climate change to local governments, we estimated that it's $6.9 billion annually by 2050. And I think one important point here is that all of these costs do not reflect the private sector and the costs that will fall on everyday citizens, homeowners, renters that need to contend with these changing costs due to climate change. So I think the Inflation Reduction Act is a great example of how we can invest and ease that burden on everyday Americans that are going to feel these impacts. They're going to feel the heat in their cities and have to contend with that. They're going to have to install new air conditioning systems. They're going to have to find ways to adapt to a changing climate that they were not used to. And so I think this is an opportunity for local governments to work alongside their residents to plan comprehensively to address this issue.
Thank you. And I couldn't agree more with that. And Dr. Vahala, let me just follow up on this question. As we think about who ends up experiencing the worst impacts of the climate crisis, it is often, as I said, poor communities, communities of color, communities that don't have the resources to, often to make the investment that they need, and then are bearing the health costs of fossil fuel pollution. Could you just address a little bit for us as you think about what's in the Inflation Reduction Act on the climate policies, how that's going to help communities, for example, communities that have older housing stock, less efficient homes, places that, and people who don't necessarily have thousands of dollars sitting in their checking accounts to make the improvements in energy efficiency and, electrification that are going to make a big difference to their bottom line and save them money.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I think the Inflation Reduction Act, coupled with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, has the potential to be absolutely transformational for the communities that are already suffering and going to suffer even more with the impacts of climate change. When I think about transit systems and heat, for example, who suffers most when our transit systems fail? It's the elderly. It's transit-dependent workers who are left out waiting for that train that's not coming because a track has melted or buckled. And they are faced with being outside more often and for longer on the hottest days of the year. These same communities are also majority renters, and they don't have the luxury of making upgrades to whole buildings. The types of energy efficiency investment opportunities that are in both EJA and the Inflation Reduction Act have the potential to be absolutely transformational for household budgets, where energy costs are a wildly increasing portion of total budgets. And so I think this is a way of splitting the problem to not just look at who loses money when we don't address climate change, but to really put in front who suffers and make sure that we don't let that individual suffering translate to economy-wide health and employment impacts.
Exactly. And when we pass this legislation, this means that it's going to be saving money for people who live in communities all across this country. Rewiring America estimates that this will save Americans who are able to who take advantage of these rebates and tax incentives. It's going to save them $1,800, not $1,800 in total, $1,800 a year in terms of their energy costs. And that is going to make a very, very big difference. It looks like a good deal to me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.